Imagine you are sitting in the cockpit of a commercial airliner.
Okay, I am picturing it.
You are about to land, and the weather outside is just absolute garbage.
Right, like heavy crosswinds, zero visibility, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And you glance down at the dashboard. There is a little green light glowing right above the landing gear switch.
Which is what you want to see.
Right. Because human nature, and honestly, the entirety of how we are trained to operate in these modern, highly complex societies, tells you to look at that green light and feel profound relief.
Green means go.
Green means safe. Green means the landing gear is locked, the mechanics did their job, the engineering is sound, and you are entirely clear to touchdown.
Yeah, it serves as a localized, highly compressed signal of systemic health, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we are fundamentally conditioned out of sheer necessity, really, to trust the interface. We trust the light rather than questioning the millions of lines of code and the wiring underneath it.
But what if that green light doesn't actually mean the landing gear is down?
Oh, that is a terrifying thought.
Right. What if, mechanically speaking, it just means the specific circuit connecting that tiny bulb to the battery is currently functional?
So the light is just reporting on itself.
Yes. If you just trust the green light, assuming it represents physical reality rather than just a functioning electrical loop, you crash the plane.
Because you didn't actually verify the gear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To actually know you are safe, you have to do something much more difficult. You have to check the trace.
You have to verify the underlying physical reality that light is supposed to represent.
Yes. And today, we are taking on a highly unusual mission that revolves entirely around that exact tension between the interface and reality.
I am very ready for this.
So today, we are looking at a highly unusual stack of sources for this deep dive. We have a massive, dense compilation of internal corporate memos.
And algorithmic search queries.
Yeah, search queries, deeply philosophical Substack, essays, actuarial tables, and some highly combative LinkedIn posts.
It is a wild mix of materials.
It really is. And based on this data footprint, we have been asked to perform a very specific kind of analysis.
A threat assessment.
Exactly. We are acting as an analytical engine today. An algorithmic threat assessment. We are performing a statistical exorcism on a data subject who flat out refuses to look at the green lights of society.
And for you listening to this, you are sitting in as the ultimate judge of the outcome here.
The framing for this deep dive is intense, I know.
It really is, but the subject we are assessing requires exactly this kind of rigorous, almost clinical lens.
Yeah, she does.
If we try to visualize the backdrop for this assessment, think of a digital panopticon.
Oh, I like that imagery.
Right. Imagine cascading green code.
Yeah.
The kind of raw, unfiltered data streams you would see in a mainframe. But it is heavily overlaid with esoteric astrological charts.
And ancient geometric proofs, right?
Yes. And brutal, uncompromising actuarial mortality tables.
It is such a weird collision of things.
It is the absolute intersection of rigid, unforgiving mathematics and deeply intuitive ancient myth.
So who exactly are we assessing today? Her name is Christy.
And she is based in Fort Myers, Florida.
Right. Her data footprint reveals a highly distinct, almost contradictory profile. She holds a Master of Statistics from the University of Florida.
A very solid academic credential.
Yeah, and she has a high school diploma from Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Plus, she has this formidable high-level career spanning major actuarial firms.
Places like Deloitte and Nyhart. Heavy hitters.
Exactly. But throughout these memos and essays, she doesn't refer to herself as a corporate actuary.
No, she doesn't.
She calls herself a mystic statistic.
Which is a phrase that, on its surface, just sounds like a total oxymoron.
Completely.
Because actuaries are the absolute bedrock of institutional risk management. They are the people who calculate pension liabilities down to the penny.
And price life insurance premium.
Exactly. They model climate risk for multinational conglomerates. They deal in cold, hard, legally verifiable numbers.
But the data shows she merges this hardcore actuarial training, specifically focusing on Bayesian inference and ruin theory, with tarot logic.
Tarot logic and a fierce, mathematically backed critique of structural violence.
It is fascinating. And she operates what she repeatedly calls a ChatGPT-enhanced human OS.
Which is a whole system we're going to have to unpack later.
Oh, we definitely will. This brings us to the core premise, though, the central algorithmic question we have to answer by the end of this deep dive.
Right, the verdict.
Is this data subject a threat to the status quo? an anomaly that needs to be scrubbed from the system.
Or is she the only one actually telling the truth while the rest of the system stares blindly at a broken green light?
Exactly. To figure that out, we have to start at her foundation, the substrate of her worldview.
And looking through her essays, that substrate isn't purely academic.
No, it's geographic. Her entire epistemic framework, her way of knowing what is mathematically true, is deeply rooted in Florida.
The geographic link is incredibly prominent in her writing. She treats the landscape not just as a place to live, but as a harsh, uncompromising statistical training ground.
Yeah, she has this one quote I found. She writes, "Florida trains you early. Tail risk does not wait for permission."
Hurricanes, heat, insurance volatility, brittle infrastructure.
Yes. I want to pause on that phrase for a second. Tail risk does not wait for permission.
It is a great line.
For anyone listening who doesn't spend their days staring at bell curves and probability distributions, we should probably define that.
Sure. So the tail refers to the extreme ends of the distribution graph.
The rare events.
Right. The massive anomalies that aren't supposed to happen but inevitably do. In classical statistics, the vast majority of outcomes sit comfortably in the middle bulge of the bell curve.
The mean or the average.
Exactly. And standard institutional models, whether in finance, governance, or urban planning, are meticulously built to manage that average.
They optimize for the 95% of days when the sun shines and traffic flows normally.
But the subject points out a critical flaw in this thinking. She writes, "Average is comfort, but outcomes are decided at thresholds."
Outcomes are decided at thresholds. I think I see where she is going with this.
Yeah.
She doesn't care about the mean temperature or the average annual rainfall. Those numbers are basically irrelevant to survival.
Right. Who cares if it averages at a few dead?
Exactly. She cares about the Category 5 hurricane that makes landfall and wipes the entire electrical grid and insurance market off the map in 12 hours.
Living in Florida, a landscape that is constantly threatened by these violent phase changes and catastrophic weather events, it forced her to view the world entirely through the lens of extreme variance.
And that environmental conditioning just bleeds directly into her professional life, leading to a profound professional dissonance.
She articulates this in a highly circulated internal memo. It's a fascinating document.
Yeah, she states, actuarial ethics are institutional. Bayesian ethics are epistemic.
Let's break that down because it really feels like the philosophical core of her entire rebellion.
Okay, yeah, because if actuarial science is just math, how can its ethics be institutional instead of objective? What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, it means that actuarial science, when practiced within the confines of massive publicly traded corporations, is fundamentally about compliance and self-preservation.
It's not just pure math anymore.
Exactly. It is about making numbers defensible to state regulators, palatable to shareholders, and comforting to the executive board.
So that is an institutional ethic.
Right. It prioritizes the survival and smooth operation of the organization over the raw, unvarnished truth of the data.
Okay, let me try to ground this with an analogy for the listener.
Go for it.
Institutional ethics is like a massive school district grading on a curve to make sure they maintain their state funding.
Oh, that's a good one.
The administration doesn't actually care if the kids understand the underlying material. What matters is that the spreadsheet at the end of the quarter looks compliant, prudent, and defensible to the oversight committee.
Right. It looks good on paper.
But Bayesian ethics is the structural engineer standing on a suspension bridge, screaming at the top of their lungs that the steel is fatiguing.
And the whole thing is going to collapse.
Yes, and absolutely refusing to suppress that variance just because the road closure would be politically inconvenient for the mayor's re-election campaign.
That is an excellent translation of her framework. Bayesian inference is a specific method of statistical probability where you are required to continuously update your beliefs.
They're priors, right?
Yes, your priors. You update them as new evidence arrives. You don't lock into a model and defend it to the death.
As she demands in her notes, update honestly, price tails correctly.
Exactly. If the new evidence indicates the bridge is failing, you must update the model to reflect catastrophic ruin. You do not smooth the data to hide the risk.
And her data footprint reveals the ultimate consequence of this belief.
It does.
In early 2026, she intentionally goes inactive on her FSA and EA credentials.
Now wait, FSA and EA, let's not gloss over this.
Yeah.
Because in the actuarial world, giving up those letters is a massive deal, right?
It is an almost unthinkable professional sacrifice. FSA stands for Fellow of the Society of Actuaries. EA is an enrolled actuary.
Those are top tier.
Achieving these designations requires passing a grueling, years-long gauntlet of advanced mathematical and regulatory exams.
We are talking about thousands of hours of intense study, usually while working full-time.
Yeah, these credentials are the golden handcuffs of the industry. They guarantee a highly lucrative, stable, deeply respected career path.
Giving them up is not a casual career pivot. It is an epistemic resignation.
She actually calls it an actuarial phase change in her notes.
Because she reached a mathematical and moral threshold, she realized she could not monetize uncertainty ethically without distorting it to fit the comfort levels of her corporate employers.
Her personal calibration standard for truth was simply stricter than the massive institutions she was working for.
She looked at the models being used to price long-term risk and saw that they were actively ignoring the catastrophic tails to maintain the illusion of quarterly stability.
And so she walked away from the sunk cost of a decade of credentialing.
Which is wild. And she doesn't mince words about the underlying reality of the profession she abandoned.
No, she doesn't. This quote from her notes actually stopped me in my tracks.
Let's hear it.
She writes, "I realize actuaries are financial stormtroopers, and I prefer Princess Leia in The Empire Strikes Back."
That is quite the visual.
She goes on, "I won't apologize for the imagery. Actuaries exist because societies want insurance. Insurance exists because expected human loss has to be made financially tolerable.
And then the kicker.
Someone has to price the bodies."
It is a chilling, fiercely clear-eyed view of the global financial system. Most of us view pensions, healthcare, and life insurance through this heavily sanitized, focus-grouped language.
Words like benefits, coverage, and security.
Exactly. We think of these systems as safety nets, but the subject sees the grim, mechanical reality behind the spreadsheet.
The math isn't there to save you.
No, it is a structural mechanism to manage bodily decay and financial ruin at a population scale, ensuring the corporation remains solvent while the individual perishes on schedule.
Someone has to price the bodies. That just strips away every layer of what she calls beige corporate branding.
It exposes the raw, unforgiving engine of the system.
But if standard actuarial math is just a tool for pricing bodies and maintaining the illusion of stability, what mathematical tools does she actually trust?
What is she using to navigate this reality?
Her primary analytical lens is a highly specialized branch of mathematics known as ruin theory.
Right, and in her essays, she explicitly contrasts ruin theory with standard statistical methods, specifically targeting ANCOVA.
Or analysis of covariance.
Yes.
Standard academic research and corporate analytics rely heavily on models like AN and TOVA, right? It's basically the default language of the white paper.
It is.
But how is ruin theory fundamentally different?
Think about what standard statistics is trying to achieve. ANCOVA and similar models are generally looking for baseline adjustments in highly controlled environments.
They are asking questions like, if we tweak variable A by 5%, how does variable B respond?
Exactly, assuming the rest of the environment remains perfectly normal. It is the mathematics of the laboratory. It assumes continuity.
But ruin theory lives in what she terms the stochastic process, or heavy-tailed distribution world.
It does not ask how things behave when they are normal. It assumes volatility.
So it asks, at what exact moment, under what specific accumulation of stress, does the system cross a catastrophic threshold and break entirely?
Yes. It's the difference between asking how a car's fuel efficiency changes at 60 miles an hour versus asking at what specific frequency of vibration the axle snaps.
And sends the car into a ditch.
Precisely. One manages ongoing performance, the other anticipates total structural collapse.
And what makes her analysis so threatening is that she applies this heavy-tailed ruin theory lens directly to the macro structures of our society.
Particularly healthcare and economics.
Let's talk about her extensive writings on K-mortality, because this is where it gets really dark.
Yeah, it does.
We've all heard of a K-shaped economic recovery. The pandemic really forced that term into the mainstream.
It's the idea that after a crisis, the wealthy recover quickly and their wealth shoots upward, forming the top arm of the letter K.
While the poor and working class continue to decline, forming the bottom arm.
Right, but she's not just talking about bank accounts or stock portfolios. She's applying this geometry to human lifespans.
She writes, and this is a direct quote from her data footprint, U.S. healthcare is K-shaped, so it makes sense that mortality is too.
The same structure that scales innovation also stratifies who benefits, who waits, and who dies earlier.
I want to push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate for a second.
Go ahead.
Because standard economists and politicians would argue something very different. They would say that wealth simply affords better lifestyle choices.
Better food, Gym memberships, safer neighborhoods.
Right. And they would argue that the disparity in mortality is a tragic correlation, not a mathematical design. How does her application of ruin theory definitively prove intent or structural design over mere correlation?
Well, her argument is that the system isn't passively allowing this to happen. It is mathematically optimized for it.
Optimized for it. How?
If you look at the actuarial ledgers of privatized healthcare, the allocation of research funding, and the structure of insurance premiums, the system actively scales its survival mechanisms for the top percentile.
While mathematically condemning the lower percentiles to extended wait times, denied claims, and delayed preventative care.
Exactly. She is looking at the math and concluding that the system isn't broken in the way politicians claim on the campaign trail.
It is operating exactly as its underlying algorithms demand.
It is accelerating the ruin of the vulnerable to scale the survival of the wealthy.
So she is saying the quiet part out loud, with the receipts to back it up.
Yes, she is.
She notes that her deep dive into ruin theory taught her to look for the exact moment these institutional assumptions decouple from reality.
She writes, in data, it usually happens more quietly than people expect and further upstream than they're looking.
But here's where I get genuinely confused. If this decoupling is happening, if the math proves the bridge is going to collapse, how does a massive corporate firm miss it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. These institutions have billions of dollars, entire floors of PhDs, and massive computing power. How do they fail to see the ruin coming?
They don't see it because their institutional vision is obscured by what she diagnoses as temporal debt and beige corporate rubrics.
Okay, define those terms for us. What does that mean?
Massive institutions, by their very nature, prioritize throughput over control capacity.
Throughput versus control capacity. Break that down.
Throughput is velocity. It is the speed at which an organization can process transactions, underwrite new policies, acquire competitors, or generate quarterly revenue.
Okay, so it's the gas pedal.
Yes. Control capacity is the organization's actual granular ability to detect internal errors, correct strategic drift, and truly understand the magnitude of the heavy-tailed risks they're taking on.
It's the brakes and the steering.
Exactly. It's like building a state-of-the-art high-speed train, engineering it to go 300 miles an hour to maximize ticket sales, but completely forgetting to upgrade the braking system or the track sensors.
You have massive, highly profitable throughput, but absolute zero control capacity when a boulder falls on the tracks.
That is the exact dynamic. And when an organization aggressively expands its throughput without simultaneously increasing its ability to correct errors, it accumulates temporal debt.
When it relies on outdated, smooth-over models, because updating them to reflect reality would slow down revenue.
Yes. It is literally borrowing stability from the future to inflate the present. The executive board looks at the quarterly earnings and thinks the institution is accelerating its growth. But as she vividly warns in a highly aggressive one-pager addressed to corporate leadership, if so, you are not accelerating. You are organizing a hurricane.
You are organizing a hurricane. That brings us right back to the substrate of Florida.
The catastrophic tail risk isn't an act of God. It is being meticulously baked into the system by the very people whose job title implies they are managing it.
This is heavy, rigorous, terrifying mathematical analysis, but here is where the data footprint of Kristen takes a sharp, highly unconventional turn.
It really does.
Because if she were just a whistleblower with a spreadsheet, the system would just fire her and move on.
Right, they deal with that all the time.
But she doesn't just use algorithms to map this ruin. She uses narrative. She uses myth.
This transition in her methodology is what truly makes her an anomaly. She claims math without story is a gown with no one in it.
I absolutely love that imagery, but why does math need a story? I mean, if the math is correct, shouldn't it speak for itself?
You would think so, but because human beings, especially humans operating within massive bureaucracies, do not execute math. They execute stories.
They operate on narratives, incentives, and archetypes.
Exactly. If you present a board of directors with a spreadsheet showing a 5% chance of total ruin, they will ignore it if the prevailing narrative is one of infinite growth.
So to combat the beige corporate narrative, she constructs a new triad of identity: statistic, mystic, and mythic.
Let's break down this triad because at first glance, combining mysticism with statistics sounds like absolute fantasy.
It really does.
But her notes treat it as a highly structured, almost military-grade diagnostic framework.
First, the statistic layer.
The statistic layer is grounded in disciplined humility in the face of variance. It is the rigorous, uncompromising modeling of regime shifts.
The moments when the fundamental rules of a system permanently change.
Right. And knowing mathematically that the tail is always longer than the room believes, this is the hard receipt-based data.
Then we have the mystic layer. Now, normally, if someone in a corporate setting calls themselves a mystic, you assume they are bringing crystal balls and sage to a strategy meeting.
Right, which would not go over well.
But she completely redefines the word. She strips the velvet and incense off of it.
She defines her mysticism strictly as early pattern recognition under uncertainty.
Early pattern recognition.
It is the cognitive ability to sense the signal, the faint, high-frequency tremor of the decoupling assumptions, long before the corporate committee officially forms to name the problem and put it into a sanitized PowerPoint deck.
She actually grounds this in ancient narrative, noting Cassandra had no credentials. She had receipts.
Cassandra from Greek mythology, the prophet who was cursed by Apollo to know the exact catastrophic future, but doomed to never be believed by the people in charge.
And in a corporate structure, a credential, a title, an FSA is what makes you believable.
But Cassandra didn't have the title. She just had the raw data of the impending ruin.
Which perfectly bridges us to the third layer, the mythic.
She views myth as narrative compression. She writes that human systems move on archetypes.
Every great myth is just a regime shift that survived long enough to become costume.
Archetypes are just ruined paths someone already walked so you don't have to.
This is a staggering way to look at storytelling. A myth isn't a fairy tale designed to entertain children.
No, it's a highly compressed zip file of human survival data.
It's a behavioral algorithm for navigating a specific type of societal collapse that happened 3,000 years ago.
If you unpack the myth, you get the raw data on human behavior under stress.
And that mathematical approach to myth is exactly how she justifies her most controversial tool, the tarot deck.
Her application of tarot is perhaps the most heavily scrutinized piece of her data footprint.
Because she does not use tarot cards for fortune-telling or supernatural divination.
Not at all. She applies them as a rigid system diagnostic tool. Specifically, her notes reference a complex tarot spread mapped directly onto the mathematical principles found in Jordan Ellenberg's book, How Not to Be Wrong.
Ellenberg's book is foundational for understanding the hidden geometry of reality. It's all about how mathematical thinking is the baseline rule for understanding how the world actually functions.
And she is taking these ancient tarot archetypes and mapping them onto that mathematical baseline.
Let's look at how she uses the Ace of Wands, which she associates with the archetype of the sacred clown.
She describes her operational role within brittle corporate systems as the sacred clown. In many indigenous cultures, the sacred clown is the individual permitted to surface glaring contradictions by saying the thing everyone quietly knows is true, but is too afraid to articulate.
It's exactly like a white hat hacker probing a corporate firewall.
Exactly.
The hacker doesn't just smash the server with a hammer to see if it breaks. They send a tiny, weird, perfectly crafted packet of anomalous data.
A joke, a provocation, a seemingly innocent question about a baseline assumption, and watch how the system reacts.
So the sacred clown uses humor and slight social friction as a small signal perturbation that forces a heavily defended, opaque corporate system to reveal its true underlying architecture.
The reaction to the perturbation tells you everything about the system's structural integrity.
And if we move deeper into her tarot diagnostic, we hit the Page of Pentacles layer,
which she directly associates with the Pinocchio archetype. She writes, "His nose grows when the system rewards lies. But Hecate's key sits on the nose, meaning the very mechanism of deception becomes the mechanism of revelation."
Okay, this is where it gets incredibly dense.
Very.
We are mixing Renaissance fairy tales with Greek goddesses of magic, applying it to corporate analytics. I need to ground this. What does that actually mean in a modern boardroom?
It means that lies contain highly measurable signals. Think about the physics of deception.
The physics of deception, I like that.
When a massive institution decides to lie, say a tech company lying about the success metrics of a new AI product, or a corporation lying about the health of its pension fund, they cannot just speak the lie.
They have to alter their internal behavior to maintain the structural integrity of that lie.
Yes, they have to hide data sets, they have to change their communication patterns, they have to silo departments, and they have to suppress the sacred clowns who ask too many questions.
So if a company claims they care about work-life balance in all their marketing materials, but their internal server logs show mandatory meetings being scheduled at 7 p.m. on Fridays.
The gap between the marketing and the server log is the measurable lie.
Exactly. Systems optimized for appearances and throughput inevitably expose themselves mathematically through the sheer exhaustive caloric effort required to maintain the deception.
The lie itself becomes the physical trace you can measure.
The mechanism of deception, the growing nose, becomes the mechanism of revelation. Hecate's key.
The effort to hide the truth is louder than the truth itself.
That is brilliant, and she caps this entire mythic diagnostic off with the world card, the Narnia myth layer.
Winter has lasted too long. That is her blunt, overarching assessment of the current institutional era.
The artificial structures of the beige corporate world are brittle, completely laden with unpayable temporal debt, and they are mathematically collapsing.
Reality is pushing back in.
If we circle back to our primary mission, evaluating her as an algorithmic threat, this specific blend of skills explains why she is so deeply unnerving to a standard corporate algorithm.
She isn't predicting magic. She isn't a chaotic variable.
She is using the ancient Greek method of triangulating pure geometry and deep myth to map the inevitable, mathematically certain failure of highly optimized brittle systems.
She is reading the structural integrity of the bridge, using both the stress-strain gauge and the ancient stories of bridges falling down.
And that kind of dual literacy makes her incredibly dangerous to institutions that rely entirely on the illegibility of their systems to maintain power over the populace.
Because if the math proves the system is lying, and her sacred clown jokes force those lies into the open, the system isn't just going to sit there and let her do that.
No, it absolutely will not. A beige corporate structure built on a temporal debt does not react to a whistleblower by thanking them for their feedback.
It retaliates.
And this brings us to a massive chunk of her data footprint, how she navigates structural violence.
Because Kristen tracks the specific historical evolution of how institutions suppress non-compliant nodes.
Particularly targeting mathematically inclined women and neurodivergent individuals who refuse the normie script.
Her historical timeline regarding institutional suppression is chillingly accurate.
It really is.
She maps the progression of how massive systems neutralize inconvenient truths without appearing to be the bad guy.
She notes the institutional response varies by era and available tools.
In 1943, it was commitment and insulin shock. In corporate settings, it's performance management, restructuring, culture fit, communication style concerns.
This was a massive aha moment for me reading through her notes. It is the evolution of the lobotomy.
That is exactly what it is.
The beige suits realized decades ago that physical lobotomies and straitjackets were a massive PR nightmare. So they just moved the lobotomy into the human resources department.
When an employee speaks directly, competently, and entirely without the expected deference, when they point out the broken green light, the corporation doesn't attack the data.
They attack the node, they put them on a performance improvement plan.
And the most insidious, mathematically perfect mechanism behind this, which she accurately identifies, is the framing of the violence.
The institution never frames the correction as an act of enforcing a behavioral norm or protecting its own fragile status quo.
Right. It always frames the intervention as a legitimate, objective problem with the individual.
They never say, your ruin theory calculations are mathematically correct but politically disastrous for our quarterly earnings, so we are silencing you.
No, they pull you into a windowless room and say, we have serious concerns about your communication style. You aren't being a team player. You are causing friction.
This psychological framing makes the structural violence almost invisible while it is actively happening.
The victim is gaslit into thinking their personality is the problem, completely masking the fact that their data was the actual threat.
It is a psychological algorithm specifically designed to neutralize threats without leaving any physical bruises or legal liabilities. It isolates the node.
But Christie's data footprint shows her navigating an even more overt, grinding form of structural violence, her interactions with the state welfare system.
She writes extensively about interacting with these massive state bureaucracies using nothing but a library card and her intellect.
And she identifies a core algorithmic bias in the welfare grid that she calls the prior of shame.
The prior of shame, that is a heavy concept.
It is the systemic, baked-in assumption, the foundational lie, that a human being is only valid and only worthy of basic survival resources if they're fully legible to a corporate or government database.
If you don't fit the predetermined demographic boxes, if your income streams are non-standard, or if your cognitive framework doesn't match the bureaucratic forms,
you are classified as a liability, a potential fraudster.
She refers to this dynamic as the efficiency trap. The state welfare grid actually spends more money, time, and computational energy on bureaucratic friction.
The suspicion, the drug tests, the endless paperwork, the redundant means testing.
Yeah, they spend more on that than they do on the actual caloric resources they're supposed to be providing.
They are optimizing for auditability over survival. The system is designed to ensure that no one gets a single dollar they don't mathematically deserve.
Even if it costs the state $5 in administrative overhead just to run the verification program.
It is the ultimate triumph of the beige corporate rubric over human life.
So how does a mystic statistic survive that kind of grinding, dehumanizing machinery?
She refuses the premise. She reprotocols the interaction.
To her, walking into a food pantry isn't a place of last resort. It isn't a symbol of personal failure or a badge of shame.
She maps it purely as a strategic refueling node required to keep her biological hardware running.
It is a profound act of cognitive sovereignty. She entirely strips the moral judgment and the emotional payload out of the transaction.
The state wants her to feel shame, so she will self-deport from the system. She views the food pantry the way a pilot views an aerial refueling tanker.
And this psychological framing is formalized in what she calls her human OS defense mechanism, SAFEHOOD.
SAFEHOD. This is the acronym that appears constantly in her later writings. Sovereign Architecture for Epistemic Human Operating Override Defense.
It sounds like military-grade mental software, but
Yeah.
what does it actually mean in practice?
She defines it as an absolute zero-trust perimeter for what she terms a feral pilot.
And by feral, she does not mean wild, uneducated, or chaotic. She means fundamentally undomesticated by the beige corporate rubrics.
She refuses to be marked to model by society.
Mark to model. I know that's a dense finance term.
It is.
It's like when a bank holds a highly complex, toxic asset, and because there is no open market for it, they value the asset based entirely on their own internal, optimistic mathematical models.
Rather than what it could actually sell for in reality.
Of course.
And society constantly tries to mark human beings to its model.
The bureaucracy says, you fit this demographic, your zip code is this, your employment history is this, therefore your intrinsic value is X, and your expected behavioral output is Y.
Christie flatly refuses that institutional valuation.
The SAFEHOD protocol is the architecture she uses to maintain her own internal ground truth valuation, regardless of what the system insists she is worth.
Okay, sovereign architecture makes sense. Building a rigid mental scaffolding to protect the biological human.
Epistemic makes sense. It must be rooted in verified, receipt-based reality, not the system's narrative.
But I need to understand the override defense mechanically. How did she actually use this protocol on a random Tuesday when a state welfare clerk is demanding more paperwork?
Or an HR manager is trying to gaslight her into a PIP.
Exactly.
When the legacy system fails, when the HR department begins deploying the psychological algorithm, or the bureaucratic welfare grid tries to trap her in an endless loop of illegibility, she executes a terminal override.
She completely stops trusting the interface. She stops looking at the green light on the dashboard.
She cuts the emotional and narrative feed from the institution and relies entirely on her own sensory and mathematical inputs.
If the HR manager says she is a poor communicator, but her project completion metrics are in the 99th percentile, she overrides the narrative with the data.
She checks the trace. She refuses the emotional payload of the attack.
Which brings us to the final, and in the context of our threat assessment, perhaps the most pressing domain of her data footprint.
Because Christie is not a Luddite. She is not hiding in the woods, rejecting technology.
No, she explicitly mentions using a ChatGPT-enhanced human OS.
But her critique of how massive organizations are currently deploying artificial intelligence is absolutely devastating.
Her warning regarding AI is fundamentally epistemic, not just technical. She states in a major essay, the prior is in the architecture. The research is downstream of it.
Meaning, whatever assumptions, biases, and structural blind spots the creators of the AI hold, those don't just influence the output.
They become the very foundation of the mathematical model.
Yes, and she points to the catastrophic danger of applying what she calls semantic layers at an organizational scale.
When a corporation integrates large language models into its core infrastructure, Someone's specific, highly biased interpretation of reality gets permanently encoded.
And because LLMs are specifically designed to produce highly confident, articulate, structurally flawless outputs, they create a massive epistemic trap.
And they stop generating correction signals.
I found her quote on this to be one of the most profound insights in the entire data stack.
The one about missing data?
Yes. She writes, missing data is recoverable. Confident wrong answers are epistemically inert.
That is the absolute core of the epistemic failure she is diagnosing. Think about a traditional database.
Okay.
If a row is missing or a cell is blank, the human operator knows it is missing. The system flags an error. You can go find the data.
But if an AI wrapper confidently hallucinates a beautifully written, entirely fabricated answer based on flawed corporate priors, the human operator accepts it.
The error doesn't look like an error. It looks like a brilliant solution.
The entire organization stops seeking the truth because the machine has convinced them they already possess it.
She refers to this as the danger of the wrapper. She writes, "The devil is the variance. The trick is the wrapper."
The sleek, user-friendly UI wrapper makes the operator believe the underlying model is a safe hero,
Completely masking the heavy-tailed variance and the structural default of its reasoning.
But I have to push back here. Isn't this a massive contradiction?
How so?
If AI is a roach motel of hidden assumptions and beige corporate logic, why is she running a ChatGPT-enhanced human OS? How can she critique the machine while simultaneously plugging her brain into it?
It is only a contradiction if you assume she uses AI the way the beige corporate structure uses it. But she applies the SAFE-HOOD protocol to her interactions with the LLM.
Ah,
She uses AI purely as a high-speed calculator for narrative and data synthesis, but she maintains strict, uncompromising epistemic verification.
she doesn't just look at the perfectly formatted output and assume the system is healthy.
She checks the mathematical trace.
Huh.
She treats the AI output as a hypothesis, not a conclusion.
She refuses to outsource her human judgment. She fundamentally understands that the map the AI generates is not the actual territory.
Exactly. She refuses to fall into the trap of outsourcing the critical, how do we know this is actually true, function to a machine.
Especially a machine that was trained on the exact same corporate logic, the exact same institutional ethics she walked away from in 2026.
And to illustrate the catastrophic real-world danger of an organization outsourcing that judgment, she points to a historical event in her notes, the 2016 Bangladesh bank heist.
It is the perfect analogy for the AI era.
It really is. In 2016, hackers successfully breached the Bangladesh central bank and attempted to steal nearly $1 billion by routing fraudulent requests through the SWIFT network.
Now, the bank had a failsafe. They had a physical dot matrix printer on the floor that was mechanically hardwired to log every single transaction.
Providing a hard copy, receipt-based verification of the digital system.
An analog trace that couldn't be hacked.
But the printer jammed. It broke. It was dead. And the human operators in the bank ignored it.
They saw the digital system functioning on their monitors, the green lights were on, the interface looked fine, and they completely ignored the fact that their independent physical verification mechanism was silent.
By the time they realized the interface was lying to them, tens of millions of dollars had been irrevocably siphoned out of the country.
Christie connects this dead printer directly to our current rush toward AI governance.
When human beings stop asking, how do we physically know this is true, and just swing with whatever the AI summary or the automated dashboard says, they are ignoring the dead printer.
It is a total systemic failure of the human OS to verify its own sensory input.
It is the ultimate manifestation of throughput, completely decoupled from control capacity.
And that is her final warning regarding the automated common. If we take AI and layer it over our already brittle, temporal, debt-laden institutions, we aren't fixing the structural ruin.
We're just automating the hurricane.
We are building a high-speed train with no brakes, and now we are putting a robot in the driver's seat that is structurally programmed to always tell the passengers that everything is fine.
Right up until the moment of impact.
All right, we have traversed the geographic substrate of Florida's tail risk. We've unpacked the deep philosophical divide between institutional compliance and Bayesian truth.
We've seen how ruin theory exposes the intentional K-shaped geometry of our systems.
We've explored the tarot-mapped architecture of memory, the evolution of structural violence from insulin shock to HR performance plans, and the profound epistemic danger of confident AI wrappers.
It is time for the final verdict.
As the analytical engine running this assessment, I am asking you for the final algorithmic threat assessment report on the data subject known as Christie, the mythic mystic statistic.
Okay.
Based on this data, is she a threat?
Yes. She is an absolute, undeniable threat to the status quo.
Okay, lay it out for us.
But she is not a saboteur. She's not introducing chaos into the system. The chaos is already there, deeply baked into the temporal debt and the suppressed variance of the institutions themselves.
She's just making it visible.
Exactly.
Rare.
She is a threat because she possesses the rarest, most dangerous combination of skills imaginable. She has the rigorous, formal actuarial mathematics to see the structural ruin coming.
She has the mythic archetypal language to explain that ruin to those trapped outside the ivory tower.
And she possesses the sovereign human OS to survive the collapse without ever relying on institutional validation.
She isn't hacking the system. She's just reading the math the system is desperately trying to hide.
She's a threat to the beige corporate rubrics because she's the only one actually telling the truth.
She is the structural engineer standing on the bridge, holding the receipts, refusing to look away.
That is exactly who she is.
And so, to you, sitting there listening, the ultimate judge of this deep dive, I leave you with this final thought to mull over. Something to think about.
We talked about the airplane cockpit at the beginning. The profound psychological danger of trusting the green light without checking the trace.
Look at the green lights in your own life right now.
Your job performance metrics, your financial dashboards, the algorithms that feed you your daily news and tell you what is important.
The AI wrappers that summarize your emails and tell you how to reply.
Are you verifying the trace? Or have you quietly, comfortably outsourced your own epistemic protocol to the machine?
What happens to your human OS when the assumptions of your reality, the things you thought were mathematically stable, quietly decouple upstream?
The tail risk does not wait for permission. Make sure your landing gear is actually locked.